Hi everyone, welcome to this session of Living with Water, which is called Anthropocene Waters, and it's number 2. My name's Tasha Pick. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester, thinking with oceanic imaginaries in contemporary film, and I'm very excited to be chairing this panel. So each person is going to present for around 15 to 20 minutes, and then we should have around 20 minutes at the end for discussion, and we'll collect all the questions for all the speakers and discuss everything at the end. So keep your questions in mind for when we get to that moment. I'll introduce the speakers one by one. So first up, we have Janine MacLeod, who is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. With Astrida Neymanis and Cecilia Chen, she's the co-editor of Thinking with Water. Her work has appeared in collections such as Petrocultures, Oil, Politics, Culture, and Downstream, Reimagining Water, as well as in publications like the Walrus magazine and the Vancouver Observer. She's currently in the final stages of writing her dissertation, which is entitled Hydrologies of Transformation, Capitalism, Hegemony, and the Meanings of Water. And her paper today is called Like the Seas We Rise, Towards a Transformative Hydrophilic Politics. So Janine, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? Oops, wait, I'm gonna hit there. Okay, can everyone see the images now?
Perfectly, yeah.
Okay, great. So both in my academic research and in the course of my participation in environmental justice movements in Canada, I have heard repeatedly from Indigenous elders and land defenders that water is a first medicine. Haudenosaunee elders interviewed about source water protection in Ontario, for example, emphasized that there is no greater medicine than water. The late Anishinaabe elder Violet Kabayosai offered the instruction that during times of difficulty is the time to get healing from the water. So you can see her on the left in this picture here. Practices and stories surrounding the healing properties of water are very much alive all around the world. What leaps out about contemporary Indigenous teachings on water as a medicine is their frequent appearance in the context of efforts to protect and restore the integrity of waters themselves. Indigenous elders and water protectors have been taking a leadership role in illuminating the reciprocal character of the healing properties of water. Approaching these teachings from an eco-cultural studies perspective, I have been preoccupied by the ways in which water's significant capacities to heal and to harm are expressed not only through their agencies in bodies and ecosystems, but also through their roles in language. As such, my impulse has been to turn to meanings and works of the imagination as sites where it might be possible both to get healing from the water and also to extend care and protection towards waters themselves. From the Idle No More movement to Flint, Michigan, from Unistoten territory to the convergence of water protectors at Standing Rock, the refrain "Water is life" has animated and connected disparate struggles against dispossession. Climate justice demonstrators chant, "The people gonna rise like the water, gonna face this crisis now," alongside placards reading, "Like the oceans we rise," and "Love water, not oil." In June of 2018, women demonstrating against the Trump administration's family detention policies sang a modified version of the same chant as they occupied the Senate Hart Building in Washington, D.C. "Women gonna rise like the water, gonna shut detention down." The women had wrapped themselves in metallic emergency blankets like those provided to detained migrants, giving the assembly a shimmering quality reminiscent of water. Along the US-Mexico border, meanwhile, the slogan, "Water, not walls," turns the jugs of water left in the desert for migrants into potent symbols of a more compassionate and just social order. In this paper, I will propose that these and other existing political mobilizations of water could be approached as nascent expressions of an emerging politics of hydrophilia. I will consider how such political engagements with and for water might be elaborated and extended in order to mend some of the rifts and fractures that have crippled left social movements throughout the neoliberal era. Clean freshwaters, living oceans, and reasonably frequent and gentle precipitation are preconditions for the achievement of every other goal that liberatory social movements might wish to pursue. In turn, a widespread regeneration of water's life-giving capacities will only be possible in a decolonial and post-capitalist future. Such a future presupposes the formation of effective, coherent, multi-generational, multi-species, and multi-scalar networks of solidarity. As many just transition advocates have pointed out, social movements of the necessary size, strength, and scope to overcome fossil-fueled racial capitalism will only emerge if a wide range of liberatory visions can be effectively drawn together. In his reading of Gramsci, Peter Ives argues that politically effective unity between diverse struggles requires something like a common language in which many different concerns and goals can be expressed. Rather than attempting to achieve agreement on some form of homogeneous and static perspective or position, he argues, what is needed is a hegemonic or counter-hegemonic language, unified enough, coherent enough to yield effective resistance to capitalist hegemony and its language. In what follows, I will propose that such a language could be made with water. The refrain, "water is life," and the emerging political identity of water protector reorient social struggle away from the negatively articulated postures of resisting and protesting towards the more affirmative activity of protecting. As Nick Estes notes in his analysis of the No Dakota Access Pipeline uprisings at Standing Rock, quote, "The protesters called themselves water protectors because they weren't simply against a pipeline, they also stood for something greater, the continuation of life on a planet ravaged by capitalism," end quote. Left social movements have inadvertently centered and naturalized contemporary systems of domination by revolving around shared sites of resistance. The familiar oppositional positions of anti-capitalism, anti-fascism, anti-racism, anti-austerity, decolonization, and the like have both reflected and sustained the condition of imaginative impasse, summed up by Jameson in his frequently quoted observation that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. In the examples cited above, social movements are already positioning water against settler colonialism, fossil fuel dependence, migrant detention, and militarized borders. In the process, water comes to stand for decolonization, life-affirming alliances, the power of women acting together to overcome oppressive conditions, the possibility of a just and hospitable response to human migration, and a collective capacity to achieve climate justice and self-determination. By reframing capitalism, colonialism, racism, biodiversity loss, heteropatriarchy, fascism, imperialism, transphobia, austerity, climate breakdown, and other forms and manifestations of oppression as water-hating social orders, a politics of hydrophilia could further potentiate water as a symbolic repository for and bearer of the affirmative contents of transformative solidarities and coalitions. Water, along with its multivalent aspirational meanings, could serve as a focal point for left social movements, with intersecting systems of oppression redefined in opposition to this central term. Gaston Bachelard argues that fundamental ideas cannot be truly felt and understood in the abstract. They need to be animated by the substance of the world. Elementary matter, he writes, receives and preserves and exalts our dreams. By making the shared substance of life into a bearer of aspirational visions, liberation as water, democracy as water, justice as water, healing and reparation as water. A language of hydrophilia would seek to render diverse visions of liberation, peace, and shared well-being more imminent, more sensually tangible, and thus perhaps more possible. Given water's involvement in basic daily routines, to fill waters with counter-hegemonic meanings could be to pervade everyday life with a sense of transformative agency. In practice, a politics of hydrophilia will draw its potency from the cultivation of strong material and associative links between water as a symbol and water as a substance. As such, the work of making a counter-hegemonic language with water could unfold as follows. Number one, bring water into the foreground of political discourse as a shared substance of planetary social life. 2, invest that shared substance with aspirational meanings. And 3, highlight the existing and potential material connections between liberatory collective projects and the regeneration of water's life-giving capacities. In such a political project, the assertion of diverse priorities would be accompanied by a recognition and repetition of water's primacy as a shared substance of life, health, wealth, and well-being. Every appearance of water as a symbol or slogan, like the seas we rise, together we are the flood, or water not walls, could thus push back against the hegemonic forgetting of water's vital relations. At issue here is the potential to activate water's relational and life-giving agencies in imaginative and affective registers. This hydrophilic reframing of political life should emphatically not involve the elevation of a reified water above all other concerns. Struggles against racialized police violence, for example, do not need to be justified by their potential regenerative impact on the quantity and quality of waters. The recognition of water's primacy is not an assertion that water is more important than anything else, but rather that it is an enabling condition for everything else. As such, the hydrophilic imperative to restore the life-giving capacities of planetary waters accompanies rather than eclipses other priorities. A radical redistribution of wealth is, I would argue, necessary for the present and future well-being of the hydrosphere. However, the goal of regenerating planetary waters does not need to be the exclusive or primary focus of such a transformation. Participants in a not yet hydrophilic politics would pursue economic justice for thousands of reasons, while noticing publicly, engagingly, and passionately that all of these priorities include and involve water. When we struggle against oil and gas pipelines, we are standing together for water and life. Could that struggle for water and life also include the pursuit of consonant political demands that are not as transparently about water? When they urged one another to be like water, pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong were not linking their shared struggle for self-determination to projects of hydrological repair. However, this connection could have been strongly expressed in their use of this slogan. Transgender justice, disability justice, and democratization, among many other aspirations, could come to be broadly understood as dimensions of a hydrophilic social transformation. Most simply and fundamentally, hydrophilic social movements could pit the symbol of life-giving water against all the forms of premature death that are routinely produced by contemporary systems of oppression. Interventions against militarized imperialism and apartheid, the neglect of public infrastructures, overdose epidemics, and epidemics of suicide, missing and murdered Indigenous women and other femicides, species extinction, deadly storms, droughts, and wildfires, violent bordering practices and racialized policing, privatized, exclusionary, and underfunded healthcare, oceanic dead zones, unsafe and inadequate water and sanitation infrastructures, hunger, and the brutalities of cartels and militias, among many others, could all be linked together as interconnected struggles for water and life. The cultivation of a hydrophilic politics could begin with this basic association of water with life, and with a simple recognition of water as a shared precondition for agency and well-being. Shared water provides a way to clearly and evocatively visualize how my liberation is bound up with the liberation of others. In addition to these more direct symbolic linkages, a number of hydrophilic logics could serve as connective tissues for diverse sites of political concern. My thinking about water as a bearer of logics is preceded by a street anemones, whose work explores the aqueous logics of water, and by Rita Wong, who writes that water has a syntax I am still learning. As I am defining it here, a hydrophilic logic is a principle modeled on particular qualities or agencies of water. Its expression should, in general, enable the life-giving capacities of waters and facilitate the realization of consonant visions of a good world. For example, water's agencies of diffusion, its tendency to spread out and distribute waveforms, chemical compounds, and other influences, could be powerfully mobilized as a shared symbol for diverse political struggles against the concentration of wealth, power, and harm. As fundamentally diffusive projects, anti-austerity movements, pro-democracy movements, movements for economic justice, housing for all, free post-secondary tuition, and universal health care, feminist struggles for a fair distribution of care work and household labor, movements for reparations and restitution, movements for a jubilee on personal and national debts, movements to break up media conglomerates and big tech giants, movements to get many out of politics, and movements for land redistribution, among many others, could all unfold in the image of water. Likewise, revolts against the concentration of vulnerabilities, burdens, and harms along lines of race, gender, class, disability, and sexual orientation are diffusive in character. When we pursue these political projects, we could say that we are being like water in our collaborative diffusion of wealth, power, land, vulnerability, and harm. Taken together, these and other redistributive projects have the potential to undermine the coercive power of capital over labor and over institutions of governance, and thus to generate the social, economic, cultural, and political conditions required for the widespread diffusion and regeneration of water itself. Given that elevated atmospheric conditions of greenhouse gases pathologically consolidate precipitation in the form of intensified floods and severe droughts, the success of contemporary struggles against climate breakdown will be experienced in large part as a broader and gentler spatial and temporal distribution of rain and snow. From a hydrological perspective, then, efforts to curtail greenhouse gas emissions and to draw down atmospheric carbon can be understood as fundamentally diffusive projects, seeking to spread out precipitation over time and space. A hydrophilic frame could turn climate mitigation into an expression of distributive justice. In reducing greenhouse gas emissions and biosequestering carbon, we are directly engaged in a life-giving diffusion of precipitation. A water-focused response to climate breakdown could thus help to highlight synergies and compatibilities between climate justice and the pursuit of social justice more broadly. At the same time, a widespread diffusion of water within terrestrial environments will be necessary as a buffer against the severity of storms, floods, and droughts. Permeable and water-retentive soils, coastlines, and built environments will render present and future manifestations of climate breakdown more survivable by allowing for the absorption and storage of rain, snow, and storm surges. The water-retentive capacity of landscapes, in turn, emerges as and when other than human communities above and below the soil have what they need to thrive. All of the living beings that generate and maintain the porosity of soils and the biosequestration of carbon require sustenance. As such, landscape rehydration involves a widespread and relationally sensitive socialization of biospheric wealth, providing previously dispossessed and displaced plants, animals, insects, and fungi with the land, water, and nutrients that they need to thrive. Such a politics would make eminently visible how the task of securing equitable access to the means of life and health for human beings is bound up with critical more than human diffusions of biospheric wealth. In a politics like water and for water, the provision of equitable access to clean water and sanitation, healthy food, housing, and medical care would thus be explicitly positioned alongside and in solidarity with the vital redistributive activities of salmon, elephants, wolves, bulrushes, alders, and whales, as these and other plants and animals contribute to life-enabling diffusions of water and nutrients. If waters were to come into prominent use as shared emblems for a wide range of transformative visions, the imminent possibility of emancipatory futures would be present in the act of filling a glass, mopping the floor, sitting beside a river, or stepping into a shower. Water, being everywhere, could serve as an unparalleled mnemonic device. Demonstrators might chant, "The people gonna rise like the water," or encourage one another to be like water, in the full understanding that their own liberation and the liberation of many others is bound up with the integrity of waters. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Janine. I'm sure everyone will want to join me in thanking Janine for that wonderful, very generative presentation. So next up, we have Megan Hayes, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon in the Environmental Sciences Studies and Policy program, where she's currently living and working on Kalapuya lands. Her work draws from the blue humanities, gender studies, feminist STS, and artistic research, and is informed by undergraduate studies in photography and situated media at the University of Technology, Sydney, and a research master's in cultural analysis from the University of Amsterdam. Megan's PhD project, How to Love an Oyster, Attachment, Chemistry, Tenderness, studies oyster-human relationships and the worlds those relations sustain. Her research is in conversation with a rich body of scholarship in which love affords a reorganization of relationships between self-other. While these theories of love may seem worlds apart from the lowly oyster, the historical and contemporary expendability and exploitation of oysters is a critical site for inquiry into these hegemonic tendencies that travel through time and space, and moreover, sites of resistance to these tendencies afford critical insights for building anti-oppressive worlds. So Megan's title for this presentation is What Is It Like to Know Water, a Bivalve Version, which is a great title. So I'll hand over to you now, Megan.
Thank you so much, Tasha, for chairing, and to Julia and Sam for having me and organizing the series. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see that okay?
Yes, beautiful slides.
Okay, thank you so much. Great, I will dive right in. Part 1. We can't unfurl unless we feel safe enough to do so. The slippery shelled mystery known as an oyster is a kind of bivalve. Bivalves are a class of aquatic mollusks that have, in the collective poetic descriptive of Wikipedia, laterally compressed soft bodies, which are enclosed in calcified exoskeletons made up of a hinged pair of half shells or valves. When they feel safe, an oyster is open to receiving the world. Us too, for that matter. As I heard one of my favorite astrologers say a few weeks back in response to Mercury conjunct Chiron sextiling Jupiter, we can't unfurl unless we feel safe enough to do so. In the right conditions, an oyster will lie in their watery milieu, fixed in place by a tiny attachment created through secretions of their own mineral bioadhesive, and they'll yawn themselves open. The act of opening through the relaxation of their two shells, a behavior known as gaping, is arguably the only discernible behavior of oysters, and it allows them to take in the watery world around them, filtering up to 50 gallons of water per day in search of food. As Dejan Lukic and Nick Kozioradsky put it in their strange and gorgeous book, The Oyster or Radial Suppleness, the oyster absorbs the world. While it's common practice today to garnish raw oysters with a squeeze of lemon, historically, this juice served a more practical function. Before refrigeration was widely available, a few drops of acidic citrus squeezed on the frilly edge of the oyster tissue would allow you to see if the animal was still fresh, by which I mean alive, as these tissues would recoil. This fringe tissue is the mantle, and it's actually an organ, specifically a sense organ, hemming the oyster body in a dark, thin, fleshy layer flush against the shell, from where it's also responsible for secreting shell, layer inside of layer. As a sense organ, the mantle allows an oyster to detect the chemistry of the water, registering in a peripheral nervous system that comprises 2 pairs of nerve cords and 3 pairs of ganglia, allowing an oyster to know the waters in which they are immersed. This acutely tactile mode of sensing the world might be unfamiliar to humans, but many other creatures like starfish, jellyfish, and corals all share the experience of living without a central nervous system, instead feeling their way to understanding. In thinking such thoughts, I am indebted, of course, to Eva Hayward, who has so lusciously described the synesthetic sensory capacities of cup corals and their fingery eyes, which make new prepositions of observation, quote, seeing with tact, touching by eye, feeling from vision. When stressed, an oyster will fasten their shells closed, which they do with the impressive speed and force of their adductor muscle, a force you'll have encountered if you've ever tried to shuck one. We humans also have adductor muscles residing in our inner thighs. Like those of oysters, human adductor muscles help us draw our outer cells into toward the midline, which can be a protective act of sealing a body into a more enclosed and solid form. For an oyster, the instinct to close around their soft body is a protective response to changes in water temperature, chemistry, noise, light, and the ebb of a tide. Given that oysters, after the larval stage, are sessile, unlike some bivalves like scallops who can use their adductor muscles to skip along the seafloor, oysters are especially vulnerable to fluctuations in water quality and pollution. They must stay in place even when water conditions become harmful. When an oyster closes, they hold tight within their shells a gulp of their watery surround. It's thanks to this marine microcosm held safe inside of their locked valves that oysters can stay closed for so long, around 2 weeks. Without it, parched, they would die. The juices that you might have sipped from the shell of a freshly shucked oyster are 2 fluids combined. 1 part this tiny, preciously held ocean, 1 part oyster blood, an indistinguishably clear and salty liquid. But in this closed state, oysters can't feed, reproduce, or filter. Perpetual stress, then, is disastrous to their capacity for cleaning water, that most revered of their so-called ecosystem services. To filter feed, oysters actively draw water in through their gills, the largest part of their body and held near the mantle. Munching on the water column, oyster diets include phytoplankton and other organic particles like nitrates, phosphates, and bacteria. The first stage of feeding, pre-ingestion, begins when an oyster actively draws seawater past their gills, where waterborne particles, captured at the filtering surface, are wrapped up in mucus. Some of these mucousy parcels travel through to the belly for digestion, while some are expelled as pseudofeces, allowing the rejected matter to settle on the seafloor, or benthos, and stabilize the nutrient cycle. It's in this way that the water is cleaned. Part 2, the bivalve, the proverbial canary. Today, the wet world absorbed by oysters and their bivalve kin is unlike the pre-industrial biogeochemical cycles produced by the beings, elements, and matter of water, air, and land. Today, it includes microplastics, heavy metals, and myriad other pollutants saturating the seas, as well as increased temperatures and acidity. While bivalves will close up when confronted with a palpable thwack of toxic water, they are slowly, reliably accumulating ambient toxicity much of the time. Sometimes their health is used as a proxy for ecosystem health. The Mussel Watch program, first developed by the EPA in the 70s and later taken on by NOAA, has monitored pollutant accumulation in the tissues of both mussels and oysters around US coasts for decades. Mussel Watch explicitly describes the bivalves they study as surrogates for water pollution and bioaccumulation. In other distributed projects, oysters and other bivalves are monitored after catastrophic oil spills and the dispersants that so often accompany them. In the wake of Deepwater Horizon, the 2010 explosion of the BP-operated offshore drilling rig, which spilled 134 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, bottom feed, benthic oysters, and surface floating aquaculture oysters were both impacted. The roaming oil would smother those at the top, and that which had been dispersed by the dispersants, by which I mean nothing more than sheets of oil made smaller and dropped from sight, as what Melody Dew calls a key form of anti-visual media, lingered in the tissues of benthic oysters down below. Tracking the health of these oysters, in which abnormal tissues are still being found a decade and a half after the spill, are understood on the terms of technoscientific rationality to be a helpful, prolonged indicator of water quality. There's another kind of technoscientific utilization of bivalve sensitivity, which unfolds a little more in the present tense. It operationalizes the fact that gaping communicates information by deliberately positioning oysters and their bivalve cousins in potentially hazardous waters where their behavior can make the presence of oil and other toxicity available to the immediacy of human senses. I learned about the novelty of this technology, perhaps unsurprisingly, on Instagram. These days, since I certifiably love oysters, my friends are always sending me shellfish content. A few months back, one of them sent me this video, narrated by @RoxyScarborough, about a clam crew who control the water supply near Warsaw, Poland. Clams for whom, Roxy informs us, there is no union. The viral TikTok was drawing information and imagery from Polish director Julia Pelska's 2019 short film Gruba Kaszka, or Fat Kathy in English, named after a water filtration plant that sits in the Vistula River just south of Warsaw. The Vistula River is the largest in Poland at over 1,000 kilometers long. And as it flows north through the country, it carries with it the impact of the mining and heavy industry concentrated in the south. The water filtration plant employs a rotating staff of clams who are networked to a computer system and have final say over whether the city will be supplied by the sometimes toxic supply of water. 8 clams are hooked up to the monitoring system at any one time, and if 4 of them close simultaneously, reliably signaling a negative response to the water, the city's supply from the river automatically cuts off. The 8 million residents of Warsaw are thus intimately entangled with those of shellfish, who only work at the plant for 3 months before going into retirement, mostly because their ability to detect toxicity eventually weakens. Piotr, whose hands we see tenderly tethering shell to plexiglass, is the guardian of the clams at the filtration plant, and he's also responsible for harvesting new recruits, as well as sending off retirees into waters where they can live out their toxified days. The behavior of these cyborg clams is measured using valvometry, a so-called non-invasive technology used to continuously monitor gaping behavior of bivalves at high frequency. Valvometry tracks the opening and closing of a bivalve to glean if the water is good, shell open, or bad, shell closed. This relatively fuzzy sensing system provides no further detail about what actually is in the water, instead communicating opaque binaries of safety and risk. The popularity of using bivalves for biomonitoring is largely due to the simplicity of observing their behavior. The first valvometer was rigged up in 1909 by French researcher F. Marceau. Marceau devised a mechanism to track valve gaping by attaching a balanced lever arm to a bivalve's top shell and a pen at the opposite end of the lever arm, so as to leave an inky record of movement on a rotating smoked drum. After a few decades, such lever-activated systems, which relied on anchoring one valve of the creature, possibly restricting the animal's movement, and most importantly, impacting the data, were eventually replaced by electronic systems able to measure the distance between the valves without fixing either in place. Other designs have tried to observe the heartbeat of bivalves, which required either using babies whose shells were translucent, cutting windows into the shells of adult bivalves, or inserting electrodes through tiny holes drilled through shell. Today, molluscan cyborg sensors are typically assembled by gluing electrodes with flexible cables onto one half shell, as we saw Piotr doing before, with a design intended to minimize disturbance to the creature's behavior. The cables carry electromagnetic currents to electrodes and a computer network that scales up the opening and closing of valves to a measure of environmental perturbations. These days, oysters are rigged up as tiny cyborgs like their Polish kin for the purposes of scientific studies, regulation, and industry, and are used to detect heavy metals, microplastics, algal toxicity, climate stress, and other environmental contamination. Sometimes, valvometry technology is used in service of understanding the impact of toxicity on the shellfish themselves, such as when an oyster farmer uses it to understand and monitor the general experience of mollusks on site. Other times, it's deployed in service of something else, like the state's attempt to protect human health or a corporation's attempt to avoid liability, like at bathing beaches and harbors to test for fecal and other bacteria. A range of surveillance-coded commercial products are available on the public market with names like Molluscan Eye Technology and Bivalve. There's also a Japanese product, Kailingual, which Kjell Eriksson has explained is a play on bilingual, kai meaning shellfish in Japanese. Each of these programs and technologies explicitly name the oysters, mussels, and clams they employ as sentinel organisms, a redux of the literal canaries of the coal mine used from the turn of the 20th century up until the 1980s to detect carbon monoxide leaks in British mines. In the presence of the odorless, colorless gas, the canaries would collapse, alerting human workers to danger. In a very literal contemporary reproduction of this technique, bivalves are increasingly finding themselves tethered to oil platforms, where they become early detectors of potential spills. Water released as a byproduct of oil and gas extraction, innocently named produced water, can carry hefty petrochemical residue, but is notoriously evasive and hard to track, given the speed of its dilution into water currents. The willed toxification of oysters located around oil and gas production units, both on platforms and on the seafloor next to pipelines and subsea production templates, allows for monitoring of known discharges of produced water, as well as providing early warnings of unplanned leakages in the water column. These systems of toxic immersion require bivalves to become proxies for exposure in a differentiated field of intimacy, vulnerability, and precarity, their precarity alleviating ours. There is a critical difference between bivalves and humans that makes this use permissible: the possibility of pain, which is at stake in the original question at the foundation of animal ethics, that of the ability to suffer. Oysters are commonly thought not to be able to feel pain because of their lack of central nervous system, which is to say brain and spinal cord, where basic sensory reactions received by nerve endings in humans and other animals are gathered and translated into the experience of pain. But it's impossible to say with total certainty on scientific terms that they don't feel pain. In fact, it's precisely because of the alterity of oysters that this declaration is impossible for science. There is no way to know as definitive knowledge because the subjectivity of oysters is inaccessible. Part 3, what is in the water? On the website of Molluscan Eye Technology, we can find a critical revelation. The French-based company, emerging out of long-term oyster research at the University of Bordeaux, explains that classical chemical analysis of water is too complex and thus too costly to perform in an ongoing manner. And so, as Molluscan Eye puts it, the simplicity and low cost of bivalve biosensor monitoring is the solution. More specifically, it's a solution because the intensity of planetary toxicity has made it such that the question is no longer what is in the water, but is there anything toxic in the water? This reframing of water as always teeming with unknowability is, on the one hand, an acknowledgement of just how much stuff has been thrust into the Earth's waters. This stuff is both swirling and dissolving in a landscape of uncertainty amidst the strange agencies of Anthropocene seas, as Stacia Limo describes it, to the point that there is always something in there, and we just need to know whether any one location is toxic beyond a certain threshold at any given moment. On the other hand, Molluscan Eye's admission points to the always vast unknowability of water. Unknowability, as Street Anemonis attests, is another one of water's lessons. We are always becoming water, she writes, but water is also always beyond us. Quote, unknowability is not about refusing to acknowledge water's many wounds and our different capacities to inflict and withstand those violences, but about recognizing that at the end of the day, water will still exceed us, our sovereign subject bodies, and our capacity to fully know, unquote. Throughout my dissertation, I've been less interested in knowing, in the vein of Thomas Nagel and his bat, what it is like to be an oyster, and more concerned with inhabiting the matter of oyster-human relation. The wet relations I've explored here are mostly in the context of using oysters and other bivalves. Use as a mode of relation might generally be built around power imbalance and a unidirectional path for agency. But use, as Sarah Ahmed writes, can be a way of being in touch with things. Use gives us a sense of things, how they are, what they are like. Use, comprehended across multiple directions of relation, can be about handling, mingling with, and even transformation. This applies not just to the thing being used. The user, the used, and their relation are all transformed by use, and this transformation can look and feel all kinds of ways. I want to suggest that the use of bivalves to know water, in ways we humans are incapable of, has the capacity to change relations, rather than reproduce relations of extraction, exploitation, and disposability. As we have seen, oysters and other brainless mollusks, so often derided as the lowest form of creaturely life, in fact have a heightened sensitivity to watery nuance than humans, through which they know and can communicate about water through simple gesture. Relations with bivalves are sometimes mediated by technoscience, but they are always mediated by water. While they might say that blood, which is itself a connective tissue in our human bodies, is thicker than water, our entanglement in what Neimanas calls our planetary hydrocommons offers a way to reimagine the contingency of our earthly kinship relations. Water is the connective tissue for life on our planet. The fact that clear oyster blood is indistinguishable from the tiny piece of ocean held inside their shells, swirling all together as oyster liqueur, would suggest that an oyster is a being par excellence from whom to learn that water might in fact be thicker than blood, as the strongest non-contingent mode of responsible relation. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That was wonderful. Yeah, great presentation. Okay, next up we have Dr. Rebekah Musk, who is an independent scholar who completed her PhD entitled Making Waves, Queer Spatial Theory and Romanticism at Lancaster University in October 2023. Since then, she's been working as a research assistant on the Davy Notebooks project, helping to transcribe and annotate the notebooks of Sir Humphrey Davy. She's published a short article on naval navigation in Byron's Turkish Tales in La Questione Romantica, which I'm probably butchering, and is currently working on her first monograph, provisionally titled The Queerness of Romantic Space, Gender and Sexuality in the Margins. Her research interests include the links between romantic poetry and science, spatial theory, and queer theory, with a particular interest in how modern scientific theories can be used to generate new approaches to understanding literary spaces. And Rebekah's presentation today is called Disorientation, Distortion, Transformation, using the materiality and molecular properties of H2O as a tool for queer literary analysis. So over to you, Rebekah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the unusual behavior of water has long been a source of fascination, both scientists and poets alike. Its ability to turn from a liquid into a solid or gas under everyday conditions, though often taken for granted, is remarkable. It is, as we've seen in both of the presentations before me, also essential for life. Indeed, in an early 19th century lecture on the history of scientific inquiry, too far. So Humphrey Davy remarked that, to a person not enlightened by modern chemistry, it is indeed easy to conceive that water would appear one of the first and most productive elements. Its vivifying agency upon plants and animals, its precipitation from air. Its apparent conversion into Earth might well encourage the idea, and the marine Venus of the ancients rising in life and beauty from the bosom of the sea seems a representation of the productive energy ascribed to water. Despite this poetic description of the productive and life-giving aspects of water, Davy, as a person enlightened by modern chemistry, tended to see water more as a destructive force, which eroded away coastlines and mountains. Although he did stop short of aligning himself with some of his contemporaries who feared an ultimate flattening of the earth. We now have a much greater understanding of the science of water than either the ancients or these 19th century men of science. And this includes an understanding of how water molecules operate and how water shapes our world and ecosystems. In light of the climate crisis, this understanding and research has never been more vital. It is now undeniable that water shapes space on multiple scales, even when its role is not immediately obvious. I'm interested in the literary implications of this fact, in understanding how water shapes textual spaces in ways that authors may not or could not have been aware of. I believe by applying a scientific understanding of the materiality of water, or more accurately H2O, to texts, we can gain an important new tool for analysis of literary space, which in turn can challenge our assumptions about space and water themselves. Now, my work on water comes from a larger research project on queering space in early 19th century poetry. I look at how textual space might be considered queer and how this affects the way that we might read poems. There's a lot of theoretical underpinning to that, which draws together work from philosophy and gender studies and cultural geographies, but it's based on an idea that space is often conceived of in binary terms and that all space has gendered or sexual associations. Some of these associations are quite overt in the ways that they encourage or restrict movement of certain bodies through certain spaces, but others are less obvious. Take, for example, inside and outside, which seems a pretty neutral, commonplace distinction. But if we extrapolate out from those terms, we get domestic and public, which, especially for the 19th century, has these more obviously gendered implications. It also raises questions of how to categorize spaces that don't neatly fit within binary frameworks. So tricky questions like, is a cave inside or outside? Reveal the limitations of binary frameworks of spatiality, and also call into question the potential consequences for related gendered sexual binaries. So the question I ask essentially is, when stable ideas of spatiality are challenged, what does that mean for stable ideas of gender and sexuality? Thinking about this in relation to water, we might broadly consider polarity, from the uneven polarity of the H2O molecule itself to the way ocean travel threatened a sense of a world built on polar opposites. The most interesting way we might use water as a tool for queer spatial analysis, though, is in its relationship to orientation and disorientation. I argue that H2O is a substance that occupies space queerly due to a range of molecular peculiarities which cause it to behave quite unlike anything else. The water molecule is formed of an oxygen atom bonded to two hydrogen atoms. This structure means that electrical charge is distributed unevenly across the molecule, with the oxygen point having a slightly negative charge and the two hydrogen points having slightly positive charges. This uneven distribution, combined with the unusual shape of the molecule, affects the way individual water molecules bond with each other. There are two types of bonding in a water molecule. Covalent bonds, represented here by the solid blue lines, which are the strongest kind of bonds between atoms, and the much more unusual hydrogen bonds, which you can see here in the dashed pink lines. And these take a lot of energy to break. And it's these hydrogen bonds between the different water molecules that explain why water remains liquid at much higher temperatures than other molecules of similar sizes. Moreover, the odd shape and uneven polarity of water molecules means they form a tetrahedral structure, and it's this structure that accounts for the unusual properties we see in ice. So at a molecular level, ice is a crystal, and that means that the molecules are arranged in a regular repeating pattern, making a shape called a unit cell, which sits beside other unit cells also formed of molecules in the same regular repeating pattern. So many substances crystallize into unit cells that fit together without any empty spaces. but ice is restricted as to the shapes it can form by its angular constraints and its uneven polarity. Therefore, its unit cells cannot be fitted together in a way that leaves no empty space. In fact, the crystalline structure of ice contains gaps almost big enough to contain an additional H2O molecule. However, even if the extra molecule could somehow be squeezed in, it wouldn't be able to bond with the molecules that are surrounding it. And that means that ice is full of gaps, which make ice less dense than water and allow it to float. So both of these unusual properties of H2O, its comparatively high boiling and melting points, and the fact that its solid state is able to float on its liquid state, help to create disorientating seascapes in the texts I'm going to talk about. However, the crucial property of H2O relating to disorientation that I want to discuss is that ice is a phenomenon of disorder. So in naturally occurring ice, it's impossible to tell exactly how the molecules are orientated or even where the hydrogen atoms are. And you can see some examples on the slide of the different shapes it can take. In other words, there's no single correct molecular orientation required to create ice. Indeed, the ice we see around us is comprised of a multitude of molecular orientations. And that matters for queer spatial theory, which is concerned with orientation and direction. So to explain the links between sexuality, spatiality, and orientation, I'm going to draw on Sarah Ahmed's brilliant book, Queer Phenomenology, where she argues that queer, after all, is a spatial term which gets translated into a sexual term, a term for a twisted sexuality which does not follow a straight line, a sexuality that is bent and crooked. The spatiality of the term is not incidental. She further explains, in being straight, for example, one's desire follows a straight line, which is presumed to lead toward the other sex, as if that is the point of the line. The queer orientation might not simply be directed towards the same sex, but would be seen as not following the straight line. Through Ahmed's work, we see how spaces which disorientate and turn us away from the straight line, or complicate the idea of a straight line altogether, have the potential to be understood as queer. Therefore, the disorientating properties of H2O can also be seen as queer, as they complicate the idea of straight lines and correct directionalities. Furthermore, as we shall see, certain phenomena such as icebergs, which are made possible by these molecular peculiarities, also reorientate both characters and readers, forcibly turning them away from the expected and the normative towards other perspectives and possibilities. So such a sense of disorientation is present in the aqueous spatiality of two of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's most famous poems, Kubla Khan and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. In these poems, both characters and readers find themselves continually disorientated and reorientated by the agency of water in a way which mirrors the behavior of H2O at a molecular level. Indeed, the unusual bonding mechanisms of H2O molecules, their capacity for distortion and disorientation, and their uneven polarity are echoed on multiple spatial scales throughout the two texts. By using both Ahmed's work and my own theoretical approach, I'm going to show how water can be considered as occupying space queerly, and how understanding it as such opens up new possibilities for reading textual space and for revealing the concealed relationships between space and sexuality more broadly. So I'm going to begin with The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, whose most famous line is, of course, water, water, everywhere. And water really is everywhere in this poem, but it does not, to borrow a definition of queerness from Eve Sedgwick, signify monolithically. Take, for instance, the seascape in which the mariner and his shipmates first encounter the albatross. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice mast high came floating by, as green as emerald. And through the drifts, the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen, nor shapes of men nor beasts we ken, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound. So here we see H2O occupying three states, ice, water, and vapor, and these combine to disorientate the mariner and his crew, who see neither shapes of men nor beasts we ken, only the threatening shapes of icebergs floating towards them through the mist. The mist distorts the shapes of the icebergs, perhaps making them seem more numerous or densely packed than they are, whilst the icebergs distort the expected flatness of the ocean, producing a moment of uncanny disorientation in which the familiar has turned, suddenly and unexpectedly, into the unfamiliar. Although the mariner is an experienced seafarer in what should be his element, the capacity for H2O to shift and change, like the moving ice around him, has rendered him helplessly disorientated. So we're already seeing how the mutability and strangeness of the H2O molecule can produce strangeness and mutability in textual spaces. Interestingly, changes in temperature, such as those we see in the poem, also act to transform the water molecules, changing both the angles and lengths of the bonds and allowing them to fit together in slightly different ways. Thus, the distortion and disorientation experienced by the mariner and his crew is also present at a molecular level. This sense of disorientation and distortion becomes more pronounced when the ship appears to fall off the map. Now, whilst no literary space ever corresponds exactly to reality, in the early stages of the poem, we have a sense of where the ship might be in the world. However, between line 106 and line 382, the mariner's ship appears to have completely disappeared off the face of the earth. It reaches the equator at noon, remains static for an indeterminate period, and then reappears at the equator at noon, conveyed by a polar spirit. It is almost as if it falls through some spatio-temporal gap, as if the gaps in the ice which surrounded the ship had yawned wide and swallowed it up. The ship goes missing, its crew are no longer going in the direction they think they are, and the reader too becomes lost at sea. If we read this in light of Ahmed's work on orientation, we see the queer possibilities of space begin to open up. She explains that the concept of orientations allows us to expose how life gets directed in some ways rather than others, through the very requirement that we follow what is already given to us. In other words, a variety of factors combine to orientate us in certain ways and towards certain objects without our awareness. It's only when we become disorientated, turned away from the normative path, that we might become aware of such influences acting upon us. By acknowledging and adjusting the ways in which we orientate ourselves, we end up turning our attention to that which is often suppressed or marginalized. We bring focus to the non-normative and force acknowledgement of its existence, bringing into view new possibilities of both direction and desire. Indeed, the seascape the mariner inhabits during this section of the poem brings into view a number of spatial possibilities which also disrupt established gender norms. In this space, movement is entirely the prerogative of the feminine, either the nightmare life and death figure who captains her own ghostly ship, or the heavenly mother whose grace acts at a distance, compelling the winds and the spirits to move the mariner's ship once he appears suitably repentant. In this space of disorientation, the mariner is no longer a navigator, no longer a manly explorer with all those connotations of command over space. His maps and charts are useless here. In this space, there are no straight grid lines or fixed points of reference with which to align. And as those socially imposed lines and grids dissolve, so do other social structures, including those which govern gender and movement. That this reflects the molecular disorientation of the ice through which the mariner traveled to reach this fantastical space shows how molecular structures may repeat themselves across multiple layers of textual space. We see similar unstraightening of space in another of Coleridge's poems, Kubla. There are multiple references in the poem to incredibly disorientating spaces, all of which have been created by hydrological processes. These include the caverns measureless to man and the sunless sea. In the interest of time, though, I want to focus on the stately pleasure dome, which can also be read queerly when we consider the role of H2O in its creation. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. Before examining the molecular mechanics at work here, it's interesting to note that there is something disorientating about the contrast in this description. The pleasure dome is sunny, yet frozen. It floats and yet contains caves, leaving the reader uncertain as to whether they are above or below the surface. It is both a divine miracle and an invented device, an unsettling blend of apparent contradictions, destabilizing supposed oppositions and collapsing a sense of an even polarity. Moreover, as it is the strange molecular properties of ice that allow the stately pleasure dome to float, then we could argue that it is kept in place by disorientation. That the stately pleasure dome is dependent on disorder makes it an interesting site for demonstrating queer spatial theory. What makes the image of the dome so enticing is its potential for exploration, its lack of definition, which leaves it open to so many interpretations. This is, of course, mirrored at a molecular level. where, despite all our knowledge, we cannot identify the molecular orientations of ice. If different orientations bring into view different objects of desire, then the links to queerness here are obvious. Ahmed identifies that spaces become straight, which allows straight bodies to extend into them, such that the vertical axis appears in line with the axis of the body. This is crucial when thinking about the spatiality of ice, because its molecular arrangement means that we cannot truly identify a vertical axis. We cannot say which way is up or down, or left or right. When we zoom into the molecular, we unstraighten the space. It is not simply a case of approaching it slantwise, of moving between identifiable lines. It is a case of not knowing which line is the vertical in the first place, of not having a sense of what exactly we are supposed to align with. Given the distortion, the unstraightening of space in this text, it is pertinent to suggest that the stately pleasure dome can be read as a queer space in which queer desires and possibilities may be fulfilled. Molecular disorientation seems to scale itself up throughout both poems, from the caves and the sunless sea in Kubla Khan to the mist and snow in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. By considering Coleridge's waterscapes at a molecular level, we are engaging queerly, turning our attention from the descriptions of water to the materiality of the substance itself. What we find when we do is distortion and disorientation across a range of scales. Water behaves in ways that should not be possible, ways that science does not still fully understand. The way it occupies space, the way it orientates itself, is different from the norm. Water is a substance that breaks rules and exudes the possibility of transformation and unusual orientation. At a molecular level, water is a spatially queer substance. Whilst the science was largely unknown during the period Coleridge was writing, it nevertheless can offer us insight into the queerness of space itself. To use an aqueous analogy, perhaps the queer spatiality of water is like ripples in a pool. Microscopic ripples in the center gradually grow and spread outwards until the whole surface of the pool has been disrupted and unsettled. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebekah. That was great.